What would you say is the main cause of chronic disease for most people?
Well, that's a tough question because so you want to think of there are basically three categories of chronic diseases. So we can break the big three down, and I
Okay.
actually think of chronic disease in four, but I'll explain why I'm talking about. I sort of think of them as the four horsemen of death,
Oh, wow.
but it's sort of three pillars on a pedestal. Okay, so the big three are in order: atherosclerotic disease. So that's vascular disease, meaning
Okay.
heart disease and stroke. So those two are the heavyweight champions of death. More people will die of those than anything else.
Yeah.
And that's been true for 100 years, and I don't suspect it's going to change that much.
Wow. Okay.
But not too far behind it is cancer. And then take a little step further and you reach neurodegenerative disease, of which Alzheimer's disease is far and away the most common and also the most rapidly increasing. So again, you have heart disease and stroke, cancer, and then neurodegenerative disease. And we'll just talk about it through the lens of Alzheimer's disease because that's the most common.
Okay.
And those three effectively make up 3/4 of deaths of people who don't smoke. If you smoke, we will change the ratios a little bit and add, chronic lung disease and a few other things.
Side note before you go on there, is vaping considered smoking?
I think it's a bit too soon to tell. It hasn't been around long enough for us to know if it behaves just like smoking did.
Okay.
So I think the precautionary principle needs to be in order there.
Okay.
Obviously, vaping is not identical to smoking, but you might be trading one known nasty thing for an unknown nasty thing.
Right.
So I think it's just, and you have to remember how long it took before the evidence implicating smoking became dispositive. I mean, that really took about 60 years.
Yeah.
So, I just personally, it's not something I would think of as, doing in abundance.
I gotcha.
So we got those big three diseases, and then they rest on top of the fourth horseman, which is kind of the answer to your question, right? So there's one disease which is not really thought of as a disease, but I think of it as a continuum that is the foundation upon which all of those sit. So it is the one thing that makes all three of those worse. And in its most extreme state, it's type 2 diabetes. But that's a continuum that starts at hyperinsulinemia, so high levels of insulin, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes. So that's a spectrum that probably afflicts, a half, easily one half of all Americans.
Half of Americans have type 2 diabetes?
No, are on that spectrum I've just described. Yeah.
The spectrum including
starting with elevated levels of insulin
daily. And we're talking about like daily, they have spikes of sugar spikes.
They would wake up with an insulin level that I would deem too high. And then anytime they eat something, their insulin is too high. That's the first step. And then that also turns into now what we call insulin resistance. And that's sort of a harbinger of insulin resistance, which means, insulin resistance means your muscles don't do what they're supposed to do in the presence of glucose. So when a person eats glucose, which is basically any form of starchy carbohydrate, so any carbohydrate that's not a vegetable, potatoes, rice, and this could be good carbohydrates that we all would think are reasonable, potatoes, rice, something like that, and includes, of course, junk carbohydrates, candy bars and stuff like that. Your body is supposed to really easily be able to take that glucose and park it inside the muscle. And it's supposed to simultaneously tell your liver, hey, stop making so much glucose, because the liver is constantly making glucose to keep your brain happy, because your brain loves glucose and needs it. And so when a person becomes insulin resistant, both of those things start to break down. They can't put the glucose from their bloodstream into their muscles, and they can't tell their liver to stop making it. So both of those things result in glucose going up, and that is actually the definition of type 2 diabetes. And then somewhere in there, you also have this problem where you start accumulating fat in your liver. And that's, so like I said, about 50% of the population is somewhere within that spectrum, with about 10 to 12% being at the far end in that they have frank type 2 diabetes.
How do you know if you have type 2 diabetes? Like, I don't even know. How do you know?
Probably don't.
Oh, I'm feeling symptoms, or is it you go to the doctor and they tell you? Would there be symptoms that you would recognize? Oh, this is something that's happening? I should take a look at
No,
this.
it's much more insidious than type 1 diabetes. And it's unfortunate that type 1 and type 2 diabetes share the word diabetes in their description because they're quite different diseases. So we'll put type 1 aside for a moment. But type 2 diabetes is a very clear diagnosis, but it's made by one number. And I don't think it's actually a particularly great definition. But the definition of type 2 diabetes is having a hemoglobin A1C, which I'll explain in a second, above 6.5%. So we've reduced the diagnosis of this to one simple laboratory test that most people would get every year. And what that number means is how much of your red blood cells are basically saturated with glucose. And once you get to a point where 6.5% of your red blood cells have been saturated with glucose, we would impute from that you have an average blood glucose level above 140 milligrams per deciliter. And we would acknowledge that above that threshold, you have type 2 diabetes. Wow. Historically, we diagnosed it by making people drink glucose and then timing, like looking at frequent, sort of defined time intervals, how high their glucose got, and we would make the diagnosis that way.
And what happens when we have type 2 diabetes? What actually happens to our bodies? Does this decrease our lifespan and the quality of our health span? Is it something that's manageable for a long time?
Yeah, it actually impairs everything. So unregulated diabetes can be acutely fatal, of course. So if glucose levels get too high and they're unregulated, you could die from a hyperglycemic coma. You could have organ failure, things like that. Fortunately, that is almost unheard of. So acute death from diabetes, type 2, type 1 is a different story. But from type 2 diabetes, almost unheard of. It's really the chronic death. And the chronic damage of type 2 diabetes comes in two flavors, or I should say has two axes. There are two things that are driving it. All three of those diseases, by the way, that I mentioned, have diabetes as either their first or second greatest risk factor.
The heart disease, cancer, and
neurodegenerative. So I would say for heart disease, actually, for heart disease, it would probably be the third biggest risk factor behind smoking and high blood pressure. For cancer, it would be the second biggest risk factor after smoking. And for Alzheimer's disease, it's a bit tricky because there's such a strong genetic component. But you might be able to make a case that once you normalize for genetics, it would be a toss-up between diabetes and vascular disease, which are themselves dependent as to the next biggest risk factor. So again, there's no disputing that diabetes is an unbelievable risk multiplier for Alzheimer's disease, for cancer, and for heart disease. And so now the question becomes, well, I mean, you could also ask, what else does it do? So, it also leads to blindness, amputations, impotence, all sorts of things that might not shorten the length of your life, but would definitely impair the quality of your life. Is
there a way to reverse type 2 diabetes?
There is, and that's kind of the great news. We can get into the semantics around curing versus reversing, but I actually like the term you used because it doesn't really force one to get into that semantics. I would say you can absolutely put type 2 diabetes into remission. And I've done this many times myself with patients, and there are many physicians who have done this. But it starts by acknowledging, what the disease is. And it is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. There's no way around that.
So what does that mean? Essentially, intolerance meaning you've abused the use of eating so much carbohydrates that the body can no longer.
I would even tone it down from there, Lewis. Okay. No, I would just say, look, let's be unemotional about it. And let's say a person with type 2 diabetes has in some combination created a metabolic environment where the carbohydrate intake is exceeding the capacity for glucose disposal, the capacity to put glucose at work. Now, I think there are 4 huge things that factor into that. And the first job of the doctor is to figure out how to rank order them so you know what to work on. Okay. So the most obvious one, because you alluded to it, and I think it is the most obvious, is intake. Yeah. How much glucose are you eating? So back when I was a marathon swimmer, I was swimming. I averaged about 28 hours a week in the water. So like,
You're burning calories. You're
I'm
burning.
nonstop swimming,
Yeah.
but I was pre-diabetic.
Oh man.
Now, how do you make sense of the fact that a guy that's in the water 4 hours a day on average is pre-diabetic? I mean, it just shouldn't happen. And in looking back at my life, I think I had limitations on two of the four things we're going to talk about. But on the input side, I had this incorrect belief that I needed to be drinking sports drinks all day.
Sugar, sugar, sugar.
Sugar, sugar. I'm drinking Powerade and Gatorade like it's my job.
Gulping it, yes.
Yeah. Like, I don't get through a swim practice without going through 2 liters of this crap.
Oh
and then
my
I'm
gosh.
drinking, I'm drinking probably a liter an hour in the ocean and stuff like that. So you can have a problem on the input side. You are simply consuming too much of this stuff. You can have a problem on the output side, which means you do not have enough muscle, or you do not have efficient enough mitochondria within the muscle to take up that glucose. That wasn't my problem. I actually at the time was, more muscular than I am now, was obviously exercising far more than I am now. But for many patients, the lack of exercise is a really key issue when it comes to type 2 diabetes.
They're sedentary. They're not moving, and therefore their body is weak, and it takes over.
They don't have a place to put the glucose. You have to have a place to park it. And there's only 2 places glucose can be stored: liver and muscle. And the liver is a very small supply. So the more muscle you have, the more places you have to store glucose.
So the glucose cannot be stored in fat?
It can, and you don't want that to happen. So you can't do that
obese.
acutely. Yes. Yeah. And you can't do that acutely. So that's not something that can happen in an hour. So the only way you can acutely get rid of glucose is to put it into muscle or into the liver. And so that's why someone with type 2 diabetes gets glucose spikes. Yes, you're right. They eventually put that into fat. But in the
liver
short
starts
run,
to break down quickly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's the third thing? The third thing, which is getting more attention now, and I think this, by the way, was the second factor in my prediabetes, is sleep disturbance. So most of my swimming, most of my swimming career kind of took place during my residency and shortly after. And obviously sleep deprivation was a big part of, surgical training. And even when I finished my residency, or I should say when I left my residency and went into, working in consulting, I still sort of took the surgical ethos with me, which was I'll sleep when I'm dead.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is awesome. Like I loved working. I loved training. I just didn't, sleep was just such an aggravating thing to me. And I remember routinely I'd, come home from work. It would be 11 o'clock at night. I'd be up at 4:30 for swim practice. Like that was life every day. And what we now realize, and this has been demonstrated so elegantly with some really clever, painful research, which is if you take normal subjects, and just sleep deprive them for 2 weeks to the tune of 4 hours a night. So that's pretty extreme, but only for 2 weeks. So if I just took, 20 guys like you and took them from 8 hours a night to 4 hours a night for 2 weeks, and then did these glucose tolerance tests, I could reduce your glucose disposal by 50%. I could basically within 2 weeks turn you into an almost diabetic just by sleep depriving you. Yeah.
So reduce the ability to assimilate it into
take that glucose. Yeah, reduce the ability to clear glucose out of your circulation.
And if it's not cleared, then it turns into fat, or it's surrounding your organs, and it's making you weak.
It leads to higher levels of insulin, which I'll come back to in a moment. You asked a minute ago, how does this disease hurt you? Well, it hurts you through two vehicles. It hurts you through the high insulin, which causes one set of problems, and then the high glucose, which causes another set of problems. So having horrible sleep, and there are some people for whom this is, unfortunately an occupational hazard, right? So, people who work night shifts, it's going to be much harder to sleep during the day. People who had dumb jobs like me in residency where, you just don't get to sleep. So there are lots of people for whom this is an occupational hazard. And then frankly, there's the things that we're doing to ourselves, too much time on electronics, we know that, sitting there looking at your phone, looking at social media till you go to bed is not good. Alcohol has a horrible impact on sleep. So, not being thoughtful about the timing of alcohol, even the timing of meals, eating too late in the evening. So lots of things we do impair both the duration and quality of our
What
sleep.